And when the cherubim went, the wheels went beside them. And when the cherubim lifted up their wings to mount up from the earth, the wheels did not turn from beside them. They stood still. These stood still, and when they mounted up, these mounted up with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in them. Then the glory of the Lord went out from the threshold of the house and stood over the cherubim. And the cherubim lifted up their wings and mounted up from the earth before my eyes as they went out. And the wheels went beside them, and they stood at the entrance of the east gate of the house of the Lord. And the glory of the God of Israel was over them. Welcome back to the So We Speak podcast. This is Cole Fakes. I'm joined by Terry Fakes. We are making our way towards one of the low points in Israel's history, here described by the prophet Ezekiel, the glory of the Lord departing from the temple. And if you've been tracking with us through this Jesus in the Old Testament series, you know that we're seeing Jesus all over the place in the Old Testament. And
hmm
sometimes we're seeing him in the failures of Israel, in the decline of the nation and the kings. And in Second Kings, we're going to see the final death knell for the kingdoms of Israel and Judah played out in these scenes.
Yes, the book of Second Kings is spanned a little bit by the prophet Elijah. We spoke about Elijah in First Kings, and his ministry ends at the very beginning of Second Kings, and then his successor is a man named Elisha, and Elisha picks up. And so, Cole, there's some really interesting connections there between Elijah and Elisha, and and then John the Baptist and Jesus. I mean, I think probably most of our listeners know that Elijah was taken up into heaven, and the prophecy in Malachi that he would return before the Messiah. But then his successor, Elisha, kind of has some connections with Jesus.
Well, as we talked about in the previous episode, these are called First and Second Kings because you talk about the kings all the time, but it might be more appropriate to call it First and Second Prophets because the
hmm
main emphasis of what God is doing in First and Second Kings comes through the ministry of these prophets. And the primary prophets in First and Second Kings, though not the only, are Elijah and Elisha. And it's easy to get these two confused. You have to wonder what the odds are that these two great prophets are going to have the same name minus one letter. But if you remember, Elijah is the one who begins. He's the one who confronts Ahab. He has the showdown on Mount Carmel. He prays that there won't be any rain. There's a drought over the land. And it's hard to imagine that anyone's going to be better than Elijah. But part of the whole point of First and Second Kings is as the kingdom is getting weaker, the prophets are getting stronger. And
Right.
so, at one point, Elijah complains that he's the only one left. This is in that depressive episode he has in First Kings 19. I'm the only one left who hasn't kissed Baal. And God reminds him that there's a remnant of people, of his prophets, who have not bowed the knee to Baal. But by the time you get to Elisha, one of the things that's really interesting that is a diversion away from our point here that we won't chase is you don't just have Elisha, you have Elisha with this network of prophets called the sons of the prophets.
Right.
And so during the ministry of Elisha, you actually have a proliferation of prophets in Israel, even as the kingdom is coming to a close. And this is important for the way we look for Jesus in the book of Second Kings. We've established, as you mentioned, that John the Baptist is a greater Elijah. In fact, Malachi prophesies this, and Jesus confirms it. You guys are looking for Elijah, but Elijah's already come. It was John the Baptist. Well, in the opening chapters of Second Kings, you find out that Elisha is going to be the successor of Elijah. And the
hmm
one thing that he asks for is
hmm
this is in Second Kings chapter 2, when he hears that Elijah is going to be departing. Of course, they don't know at this point how he's going to depart.
Right.
He asks that he could have a double portion of Elijah's spirit upon him, which is a pretty ambitious ask. And basically, Elijah tells him that this will be the case if he sees him depart. And
Right.
so, probably many people remember the scene. They're walking along, and chariots of fire come and sweep Elijah up to heaven. He doesn't die. He ascends up to heaven, and Elisha is there, and he takes up his cloak, and he gets the double portion. Okay, so a little bit of a little bit of imaginative reading here. If Elijah is John the Baptist and Elisha is the successor to Elijah with a double portion of his spirit, then there's something really instructive about reading Jesus as the successor of John the Baptist through the lens of Elisha. So
Right.
Jesus is a true and greater John the Baptist, right? That John the Baptist says that in the opening. I'm not even worthy to untie the sandal of the one who is to come. He
Hmm.
has a greater portion. Elisha is the greater Elijah. And so there's some things about Elisha's life that are helpful for us to see Jesus in this Old Testament narrative.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the fundamental things is Elisha's message, same as Elijah's, was repent. Israel, Judah, in this case, you need to turn back to God. But there are some really specific parallels. And obviously, Jesus is far greater than Elisha, but you see it in, I think, his miracles, Cole. And I can think of three off the top of my head. One is Elisha feeds 100 uh, warriors, 100 people with a limited amount of bread, kind of foreshadowing the feeding of the 5,000. He heals Naaman, the Syrian, of leprosy. So he heals the lepers, which is such a predominant thing in Jesus' ministry. And maybe the biggest is that he raises the Shunammite woman's son from the dead. And so you just think about those three, and all three of those Jesus does in greater ways. But the miracles that God allows Elisha to do sort of foreshadow Jesus as well.
There are some very striking similarities between these two. As you mentioned, these children who are raised from the dead, this is also something that Elijah does. But it is something that you see in the ministry of Jesus that people interpret as a messianic sign.
Right.
In the same way as healing a blind person who's been blind from birth, that was something that the Messiah was going to do. This raising people from the dead, especially in the style of Elijah and Elisha, is was really eye-opening to the people who knew the tradition of the prophets. And there's another piece here that we have to include, and that is in 2 Kings chapter 5, when you see Naaman, who's the foreign general who comes to be healed of leprosy, when he's cleansed through what we call kind of a baptism, washing
Uh-huh.
himself in the river, the Jordan River. This is something that's very similar to what Jesus is going to do, but it's actually also something that Jesus refers to in Luke chapter 4.
Hmm.
And so we talked about this last week. This is Jesus's synagogue sermon in Nazareth, where he's telling the people that the prophecies of Isaiah are being fulfilled, the eyes of the blind are going to be opened, the captives are going to be set free, the year of the Lord's favor is here. And everybody's loving the sermon up to that point. But then afterwards, he condemns them because they don't believe in him and says, it's not a coincidence that Elijah had to go to a Gentile woman and Elisha had to cleanse a Gentile general because there was no faith in Israel. And this is the thing that makes them so mad they run him out of town. So there are these Jesus is playing a similar role. This is the theological word for this is recapitulation. He is
Hmm.
recapitulating the history of Israel in his own life. He's doing the things that the great people of Israel did. We've seen this now with Elijah and Elisha. We've seen this with David. We've seen this with Moses. We've seen this with Abraham. We've seen it with Adam. Jesus is reliving the lives of these people, some of these huge events, but showing the faithful way to navigate through these events, doing all these wonderful things, but without sin. So that's a piece of it. And then, of course, the stories themselves are the backdrop for Jesus' teaching. He's
Right.
assuming that the Jewish people he's talking to know these stories, and he's making points out of the ministries of Elijah and Elisha, Naaman, and all these other characters, so that he'll have common ground to speak to the people. Well, this is very instructive for us. You cannot understand the ministry of Jesus unless you have that same backdrop. And so this is one of the reasons we're doing this series is we want people to be able to understand the Old Testament on its own terms, but we also want people to understand the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament, which is how we see Jesus fulfilling the Old Testament as he was teaching and preaching in Luke 4 and Luke 24 and in Acts chapter 2. All of these things in the Old Testament were meant to teach us
Right.
something about Jesus. I'll add one more thing on this prophet theme before we move away from it. So after Elijah and Elisha die, Elisha dies in 2 Kings 13. There are other prophets, so it's not just these two. And maybe the
Hmm.
most notable in Second Kings is when you get to the reign of Hezekiah, the prophet that intervenes there is the prophet Isaiah.
Hmm.
And so we get Isaiah in his chronological context, which we don't usually talk about Isaiah there.
Right.
We usually go to his book and talk about him, although there's narrative of this same set of circumstances in the book of Isaiah
In
and
Isaiah.
in
Right.
Second Kings. And so you have this crossover. But think about this, the main prophet during the time of Hezekiah, who's one of the last great kings of Judah, is the one who writes things like Isaiah 53, talking about the one who will come and die for our sins and be pierced for our transgressions. He's the one with all the passages we read at Christmas, his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Holy One, Everlasting Father. The lion will lay down with the lamb. All those passages are being spoken to Israel during this time of Second Kings. Again, as the kingdom is declining, even though it has a
Yes.
little renewal under Hezekiah and under Josiah, there is this prophet who is giving us the clearest picture of who Jesus is going to be and what he's going to do in the New Testament, who's living at that time in Israel and speaking about what God's going to do through his Messiah.
I agree. One final point I'd make here is I think recapitulation is the right way to look at this, maybe more than foreshadowing, although both are valid. But in the case of Elisha, I want you to think about it this way. If you lived at the time of Elisha, you didn't necessarily understand him as uh, foreshadowing the Messiah. Now, there are times that the Jews, even of the time, understood this is pointing toward the Messiah. It's not that you necessarily understood him preaching about repentance and him doing those miracles that, oh, the Messiah is going to do those exact miracles. It's not so much that. They took it for what it was at the time. Where it becomes important is when Jesus does it, and he does it to tap into the circumstances of Elisha. And this is where knowing the Old Testament makes a big difference. You can look at Jesus and say, wow, he's awesome. He's the Messiah because he's feeding the 5,000 and he's healing the lepers and he's raising the dead. But there's an additional layer when you realize, oh my goodness, and this is what the Jews would have thought, this is Elisha. Looking back, I see that what God was doing there was preparing us for something he would do here. So I think sometimes you read these stories and you realize this is sort of time delay. It was important at the time, but it's going to be really important later. And so
Mhm.
I think your idea of Jesus is recapitulating it specifically to tap into the the spiritual themes that were going on at that time.
Right. And that's where Jesus is saying things like those who have ears to hear, those who have eyes to see.
Exactly.
This is how you develop those eyes and ears is by knowing this backdrop. We've been moving towards the climactic moment, or maybe we should call it the anticlimactic moment of the Old Testament, which is the conquering of Judah and the exile of the Jews by Babylon in 586. And Second Kings brings us up to that moment and a little past it, which is interesting. We'll come back to
Hmm.
that. But as you go through these kings, you have Hezekiah, who is a good king, a faithful king. You have Josiah, who is a reformer but dies early, and his reforms do not take hold. And after his sons in succession reign in Judah, they are not faithful kings, and they are conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. And Second Kings 25 tells us what happens when Jerusalem is conquered. And so the 25th chapter of Second Kings begins in the ninth year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came with all his army against Jerusalem and laid siege to it. Now, in some of our other episodes, or if you've studied the chronology of the Old Testament, you know that this is actually not the first time that Nebuchadnezzar has been through here. He's been through several times before. He's already taken Daniel and his friends and these influential youths. In fact, what he set up was basically a vassal system that
Right.
the last kings of Judah decided that they didn't want to do anymore. And so he comes back and conquers them. And there's a lot geopolitically going on here. And so you can listen back to our Ancient Empires series, the ones that we did on Assyria and Babylon would be really instructive for this period and what kind of geopolitical factors were motivating both
Hmm.
Nebuchadnezzar and the kings of Judah, what happened after the northern kingdom was conquered. But as the kingdom is conquered, one of the things that happens is the temple is destroyed. So you have this temple of Solomon, which we began First Kings, if you remember, with this prayer that a temple would be built, and David wants to build the temple. But God tells him, "No, you're a man of blood, a man of war. Your son
Hmm.
is going to build the temple," and Solomon does. And the high point of the first part of First and Second Kings is First Kings chapter 8, where Solomon dedicates the temple, and the glory of the Lord comes down and fills the temple.
Hmm.
Now, the bookend of that is after, almost 500 years, let's call it 450 years, you have the departure of the glory of the Lord from the temple and its destruction. So kind of an open door, closed door at the end of this narrative. And this is hugely significant. This is without a doubt, next to the Exodus, the most important
Hmm.
event in the history of Israel. And that is the destruction and the exile of the people away from the land into the land of Babylon. And there's this storyline that comes to a close, which is God's dwelling with his people in this temple. But there's also a storyline that begins in the departure of the glory of the Lord has a promised return. And we're waiting, as you're reading the Old Testament, we're waiting to see when the glory of the Lord will return. And in fact, we'll get to this as we get into the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. When they come back and they rebuild the temple, one of their big problems is the glory isn't here. So the prophet Haggai, for example, says, this doesn't, this, something's missing here. This doesn't look like it's supposed to. God's not dwelling in here. But then he
Hmm.
prophesies that actually the glory of the temple, the new temple, will exceed the glory of the old temple. And this is physically fulfilled in Herod's temple, in that
Right.
Herod's temple is mega compared to Solomon's temple. It's so much grander, nicer.
Hmm.
It is a wonder of the ancient world. But it's spiritually true when Jesus comes into the temple. And you notice this in the Gospel of John, especially because John puts Jesus coming into the temple in chapter 2, whereas you see the
Hmm.
cleansing of the temple later in the Gospels. And I think a lot of people think he probably did this twice. I think that's the easy explanation for why there's two narratives. But regardless of why you think that is, John wants you to see very early on, and he runs this as a thread through his gospel. Jesus is the glory of the temple. He not only restores it, he comes into the temple from the Mount of Olives, the east. We just read that passage in Ezekiel.
Right.
Later in the book, he's going to say that the Messiah is going to come from the east. He not only comes into it to restore the glory to the temple, of course, he is the glory of the temple because he says things like, "This place is going to be destroyed and I'm going to rebuild it in 3 days." And people say, "What are you talking about? To rebuild the
Hmm.
temple after the exile took 50 years, during the time of Herod. How are you going to rebuild it in 3 days?" Sure enough, the temple is going to be destroyed again in 70 AD. Jesus is going to rise from the dead in 3 days. And so Jesus becomes the glory of the temple. And so we're seeing a preview of that in First and Second Kings, even as we get to the end where the temple is destroyed, and the hope that it's going to be rebuilt is going to be fulfilled when Jesus comes into the temple, not just when Herod decides to rebuild it 500 years later.
Exactly. Yeah, Herod rebuilds the physical temple, but there's not an ark there. The glory of the Lord doesn't descend into the temple. His presence doesn't return. You hit one of two really good points at the end. One is that as the glory of God leaves the temple, there's the promise of his return. And that happens in the person of Jesus. But there's one other promise and one other thread that's running through it, and that is, and to me, that's in huge jeopardy at the end of Second Kings, and that is that the Davidic covenant, and that there will be a king to establish his kingdom forever of the line of David. Well, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians are killing a lot of kings here. And so, how does that thread stay alive at the end of Second Kings?
This is an amazing connection, and it when you're reading through, if you're on a Bible reading plan or something, it's been bad for a while, and then all of a sudden you get to the very end and you
Yeah.
read this in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah. So this is one of Josiah's sons. And in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, evil Merodach, who's the king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, graciously freed Jehoiachin, king of Judah, from prison And he spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat above the seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin put off his prison garments, and every day of his life he dined regularly at the king's table. And for his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king according to his daily needs, as long as he lived. So after all the destruction, you get this little glimmer of hope at the end. And there's a lot of
Hmm.
questions. Why wasn't Jehoiachin killed? That's one of the big
Right.
questions. So many of these other kings and
Mm.
in the line
The
of
others were.
Josiah,
That's right.
because
Yeah.
that's what you would do when you'd conquer a people, is you'd make sure
Hmm.
there's no upstart for people to rally around. You see this even up in the history of modern kingdoms. They don't want somebody who has the bloodline to survive. So why did
Hmm.
he survive? And then secondly, why after 37 years was he seated at the king's table? We don't know, other than
Right.
God's providence. And the way this becomes really significant is it fulfills the promise to David in an unbelievably unlikely way. So by the time you get to Matthew chapter 1, where he's tracing the line of Jesus from Abraham and from David, he writes, and Josiah, the father of Jeconiah. So Jehoiachin's name in the New Testament is Jeconiah, but this
Right.
is the same person. The father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, which that will ring a bell again from the book of Haggai and from Ezra and Nehemiah, because Shealtiel, his son Zerubbabel, is going to be the one to rebuild Jerusalem.
Right.
And we're going to encounter him later when we get to that. But the line continues. So you have Zerubbabel who comes back in the royal line, and he is going to be the one that rallies the people of Israel. And from his line, you're going to have the Messiah come. So God preserves his people, and he preserves a remnant. He preserves the bloodline in a way that even in the annals of history, not just talking about the Bible, even in the annals of
Right.
history, this seems very odd. Why would this happen? Why would he be left alive? Why would he be given any privilege whatsoever? But God was still working. Even though his people were exiled, he was not done with his people.
Yeah. Second Kings ends in the darkest event in Jewish history, and yet in the midst of it, there are these two threads of hope that God will return and that he remembers his promise to put a king on the throne of David. And I think there's a great historical lesson because you do see both of those things, those threads come together at the center point of history, and that is Jesus. God comes again down to his people. But I also think there's a great lesson for us is even in the darkest times, there's God always has a ray of hope. He always continues his thread of hope in our lives. And to me, Second Kings is you don't often see it unless you stop and think about it. But what God is doing is even in the darkest time in Jewish history, there's the ray of hope.